The zip ties were cheap. That was my first disappointment. When you hold the title of Prime Omega and operate as the highest paid independent contractor in the global underworld, you develop certain standards. If someone is going to go through the trouble of abducting me, I expect at the very least military-grade reinforced steel cuffs. Instead, the plastic cutting into my wrists felt like it had been bought in bulk from a local hardware store. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The air in Hell's Kitchen tasted of damp concrete and brewing storms. I'd been standing outside my favorite corner cafe, waiting for my flat white when I noticed them. 4 men moving with all the subtlety of a marching band. They smelled of stale tobacco, cheap adrenaline, and the distinctive sour sweat of amateur street thugs. I had mapped their approach 3 blocks down 9th Avenue. I could have broken the leader's windpipe before he even unzipped his jacket to reveal the rusty Glock tucked into his waistband. But frankly, I was bored. It had been a slow week since moving into the Manhattan penthouse, and I was morbidly curious to see who possessed the sheer monumental stupidity required to target me. So when the muzzle of the gun pressed against my lower back and a voice trembling with fake bravado whispered, "Get in the van, pretty boy," I just sighed, let go of my coffee, and complied. The van ride was an insult to tactical operations. They blindfolded me but didn't plug my ears or mask my scent receptors. I tracked our route effortlessly by the sound of the traffic and the shifts in velocity. We headed south, merged onto the FDR Drive, crossed the Williamsburg Bridge, and plunged into the decaying industrial heart of Brooklyn. The tires crunched over broken glass before the engine died. They dragged me inside what smelled like an abandoned fish-packing warehouse, shoving me roughly onto a metal chair. When they finally ripped the hood off my head, the harsh glare of a single flickering sodium bulb blinded me for a fraction of a second. "Stay put, sweetheart. We ain't gonna hurt you if your boyfriends pay up," the leader sneered. He was a kid really, maybe 25, wearing a faux leather jacket and sporting a thick grating Brooklyn drawl. I blinked against the light, my face an entirely blank canvas. I didn't say a word as I watched them fumble with a cracked smartphone trying to set up a ransom video. It was agonizing to witness. The lighting was completely wrong. They positioned me with my back to a grime-covered window, severely overexposing the shot. My face would be nothing but a silhouette. Furthermore, the angle of the camera was too high, diminishing any sense of intimidation they hoped to project. If I were grading this abduction, they would already be failing. "All right, hit record," the leader barked. He stepped into the frame, puffing out his chest, completely unaware that he had left his left flank wide open. "Listen up, Sterling. We got your little Omega toy. You want him breathing? You transfer $10 million to the offshore account we send you, or we start sending him back in pieces." He ended the recording with a dramatic swipe of his thumb. "Send it." A sharp click signaled the message was sent. I remained perfectly still in my chair, my breathing slow and controlled. The air in the warehouse was cold and damp, stinking of mold and old rust. But deep in my chest, beneath the physical world, something entirely different was happening. As a bonded Omega, especially one bound to 3 of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard, I don't need a phone to know they received the message. I carry their presence inside me. The quad bond is a living, breathing network of raw emotion and biological imperative. It took exactly 4 seconds for the video to deliver. The moment it did, the bond snapped violently to life, hitting my nervous system like a physical shockwave. First came the enigma, Dominic. A sudden suffocating wave of midnight and cold steel crashed through my mind. It wasn't panic. Dominic Sterling didn't do panic. It was a cold, absolute world-ending fury. I could almost hear the sound of crystal shattering in his hand, could feel the precise moment his perfectly tailored composure fractured to reveal the apex predator underneath. Then came the alpha tactician, Julian. His presence in the bond spiked like a jagged heart monitor, a sharp electric burst of winter ozone and fresh snow. Beneath the raw fear of losing me, I felt the terrifying speed of his intellect engaging. Right now, miles away in Manhattan, Julian Reed was dismantling the city's digital infrastructure. He was already tracing the IP address, hacking traffic lights, and pulling satellite feeds. He would have our exact coordinates before the thugs even put their phone back in their pockets. Finally, the enforcer, Axel. His reaction wasn't a wave, it was an explosion. Pure, unadulterated smoke and hot iron flooded the bond. It was a roar of primal territorial violence that made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Axel Thorne didn't think he reacted. He was likely already kicking open the armory door, loading armor-piercing rounds into weapons designed to turn buildings into dust. The sheer biological pressure radiating from the bond was staggering, making my own pheromones involuntarily spike a subtle bloom of night flowers and blood-soaked silk that the thugs, being unbonded and ignorant, completely failed to notice. "What are you smiling at, huh?" the leader snapped, noticing the slight upward curve of my lips. He stepped closer, brandishing the rusty Glock. "You think this is a joke?" I looked up at him, my dark eyes completely devoid of fear. I flexed my wrists just a millimeter, feeling the cheap plastic of the zip ties groan under the pressure of prime omega strength. I could snap them in half a second. I could kill all 4 of them with the pen in my breast pocket before the leader could pull the trigger. But why ruin the fun? "I am not smiling at a joke," I replied, my voice a soft, cultured murmur that echoed strangely in the cavernous warehouse. "I am smiling because you didn't just take a hostage, you pulled the pin on a grenade." I leaned back against the uncomfortable metal chair, getting as comfortable as possible. Now I whispered the bond in my chest, practically vibrating with approaching death. We wait for the explosion. Time is a funny concept when you are biologically tethered to 3 apex predators. For the amateur thugs pacing in front of me, the last 10 minutes were a countdown to a payday. For me, they were a masterclass in reading the biological telemetry of impending doom. I didn't need to be in the command center of our Manhattan penthouse to know exactly how they were tearing the city apart to get to me. The quad bond provided a real-time high-definition feed directly into my nervous system. Sitting in the uncomfortable metal chair, I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out the smell of old fish and cheap cigarettes. Julian. A sharp rhythmic pulsing started at my left temple, the physical manifestation of his hyperfocus. The frantic winter ozone of his initial panic had smoothed out into a terrifying, icy calculation. I could literally feel him tearing into New York's digital infrastructure. It was a sensation like running a perfectly honed blade along a whetstone. He was hacking the NYPD mainframe, slicing through firewalls, and isolating local cell towers. I smiled inwardly as the phantom chill of his pheromones brushed against my mind. He was turning every traffic light from Midtown to Brooklyn a solid continuous green for their convoy, while gridlocking every cross street. "Axel." My blood ran hot, a sympathetic response to the sheer toxic volume of adrenaline dumping into his veins. I could taste copper and heavy gun oil at the back of my throat. He was a caged beast, throwing himself against the bars. I knew with absolute certainty that he was currently strapped into tactical Kevlar, methodically loading armor-piercing slugs into his customized AA-12 automatic shotgun. The scent of raw smoke and molten iron flooding the bond was so thick, it made my core clench. He didn't want to rescue me. He wanted to unmake the people who took me. And Dominic. If Julian was the winter storm and Axel was the roaring fire, Dominic was the black hole that swallowed them both. The Enigma's presence in my chest was a crushing, suffocating weight of midnight and cold steel. He wasn't projecting anger. He was projecting a void. It was the absolute sociopathic calm of a man who had already decided that everyone in this zip code was legally dead. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. His control was absolute, holding the explosive rage of the 2 alphas in check just long enough to point them at the target. $10 million. The kid in the faux leather jacket muttered, pacing in front of my chair. Let's call him Leather. He was biting his fingernails high on the illusion of power. We are gonna be kings of the Bronx boys. The syndicate is gonna have to make me a capo for this. The Bronx Syndicate, I mused silently. So that is who outsourced this circus. I filed the information away. Julian would appreciate the shortcut, though I doubted the syndicate would exist by tomorrow morning. Hey, pretty boy. Leather snapped his fingers in front of my face. You think your sugar daddies are scrambling right now. You think they are crying over their missing pet. I looked up at him. The sheer, breathtaking irony of his question almost made me laugh out loud. Scrambling isn't the word I would use, I replied mildly. And they don't cry. I shifted my focus back to the bond. The physical distance between us was closing rapidly, amplifying the connection until it hummed against my bones like a tuning fork. They were on the FDR drive. They were moving at a suicidal pace, likely pushing the armored SUVs well over 120 miles an hour. They were crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. The connection spiked sharply. They were crossing the water. The thugs remained completely oblivious. One of them was actually eating a bag of stale potato chips. I watched a crumb fall onto his stained t-shirt and briefly considered breaking his neck first just for the aesthetic offense, but decided to let Axel have the honors. It was important to let your partners vent. They were 10 blocks away. The ambient temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop. Even without dynamic biology, the thugs finally began to feel the atmospheric shift. Animals always know before the earthquake hits. Leather stopped pacing. The chip eater froze his hand halfway to his mouth. Outside, the distant wailing sirens of Brooklyn police cruisers abruptly died, cut off mid-screech. Julian had killed the local dispatch comms. They were 3 blocks away. Did you hear that? One of the thugs whispered nervously, clutching a rusted pipe. Then came the sound, the deep guttural roar of high-performance V8 engines tearing through the abandoned industrial district. Not one vehicle, but a convoy. They didn't slow down to assess the perimeter. They didn't park discreetly. The deafening screech of military-grade run-flat tires locking up and dragging across the cracked asphalt outside echoed through the warehouse. The heavy thud of 3 armored G-wagons slamming to a halt right at the loading dock. Leather swallowed hard, his fake bravado evaporating instantly. He aimed his Glock at the massive rusted iron doors of the warehouse, his hands shaking so violently I could hear the internal mechanism of the cheap gun rattling. Before a single car door opened, before a single foot touched the ground, their pheromones hit the building. It was a biological tidal wave. The suffocating blend of enigma, midnight winter ozone, and raw iron bled through the cracks in the walls, thick and heavy. The thugs' betas and unpresented weaklings began to choke. One of them actually dropped to his knees, clutching his throat as his primitive brain screamed at him to submit to the apex predators outside. I didn't choke. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of my mates wash over me, soothing the slight irritation of the cheap zip ties. I stretched my legs out, crossing them elegantly at the ankles. "Class is in session," I whispered to the terrified men right before a massive explosion tore through the warehouse. The word explosion does not quite do justice to the sheer concussive violence that tore through the warehouse. It was less of a sound and more of a localized seismic event. The massive rusted iron doors at the loading dock didn't just open, they were violently uninstalled from their hinges by a shaped C4 charge folding inward like wet cardboard. A shockwave of pulverized concrete rust and freezing winter air blasted into the cavernous space. The amateur thugs didn't stand a chance. The concussive wave picked up Leather and threw him hard against a stack of wooden pallets. The chip eater dropped to the floor, covering his ears and screaming something unintelligible. I, on the other hand, simply closed my eyes to shield them from the dust, maintaining my elegantly crossed legs on the uncomfortable metal chair. I had braced my core a fraction of a second before the blast. Perfect timing. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, they stepped through the breach. They didn't rush in blindly. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized precision of an apex predator pack executing a hunt. Axel came through the dust cloud first, a towering silhouette of tactical Kevlar and pure, unrestrained violence. The barrel of his custom AA-12 automatic shotgun swept the room, seeking a target, any target to obliterate. Julian flanked him wearing a bespoke slate gray suit beneath a sleek overcoat, a suppressed Heckler & Koch MP7 in his hands. His eyes, usually warm and calculating, were flat dead and entirely merciless. And then came Dominic. The Enigma didn't carry a visible weapon. He didn't need to. He walked through the ruined doorway as if he were stepping into a boardroom, his charcoal cashmere coat completely unbothered by the settling dust. But the look on his face, a mask of cold, beautiful, world-ending apathy, promised a fate far worse than anything Axel's shotgun could deliver. But the visual threat was nothing compared to the biological one. Their pheromones hit the confined space of the warehouse like a physical, localized hurricane. It was an apocalyptic blend of Axel's raw smoke and molten iron, Julian's biting winter ozone, and Dominic's crushing, suffocating midnight steel. For a bonded Omega, this scent was a dark, intoxicating symphony of protection and belonging. For the unpresented, pathetic betas currently bleeding on the concrete, it was biological terrorism. The primal weight of 3 enraged top-tier dominants forced the thugs to the ground. Leather, who just minutes ago had bragged about becoming a capo, was currently curled into a fetal position, weeping openly and hyperventilating as his primitive brain ordered his body to submit or die. The chip eater actually vomited out of sheer physiological terror. They were looking for me. I could feel their desperate, frantic scan of the room through the bond. They expected to find their Omega terrified, bleeding, or worse. They were ready to burn Brooklyn to the bedrock in retribution. It was time to intervene before Axel accidentally turned someone into red mist. I stood up. With a casual, almost lazy flex of my wrists, the cheap plastic zip ties groaned and snapped with a sharp cracking sound, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. I took a moment to brush a layer of concrete dust off the shoulders of my tailored black turtleneck. I walked over to where one of the thugs had dropped his rusted metal pipe. I picked it up, testing its balance in my right hand. It was too long for close-quarters combat, terribly weighted, and completely useless as a blade. But as a makeshift classroom pointer, it would do just fine. Before I spoke, I opened my scent glands fully. I didn't try to fight their pheromones. I welcomed them. A rich, heavy wave of night-blooming flowers and blood-soaked silk rolled out from me, slicing through the smoke and the ozone and the iron. It was a biological caress, a siren song designed to wrap around my 3 frantic monsters and soothe the feral howling things inside their chests. I am here, my scent whispered into the bond. I am whole. Stand down. Through the clearing dust, their eyes snapped to me. All 3 of them froze. Axel's shotgun stopped mid-sweep. Julian's tactical stance faltered. Dominic's murderous enigma aura visibly stalled his dark eyes, widening just a fraction of a millimeter at the sight of me standing there completely unbothered, armed with a piece of garbage. I raised the metal pipe and tapped it sharply against the back of my metal chair, creating 2 loud metallic clangs. The sound echoed loudly in the sudden deafening silence of the warehouse, cutting through the pathetic sobbing of the thugs. Yaoi! I projected my voice, making sure the acoustics carried my cultured, annoyed tone perfectly across the room. It is incredibly bad manners to interrupt a lecture. Axel blinked once, then twice, his broad chest heaving against his tactical vest. Keegan! His voice was a deep, confused rumble, completely at odds with the weapon in his hands. I was in the middle of a very important performance review. I continued gesturing vaguely at the weeping men on the floor with my pipe. I sighed, letting a touch of dramatic disappointment bleed into my tone. I was explaining the standard operating procedures for high-value abductions. We were just getting to the section on securing the perimeter, and you 3 completely ruined my momentum. The absolute silence that followed was comedic gold. Julian slowly lowered his MP7, his brilliant calculating mind visibly blue-screening as he tried to reconcile the hostage rescue scenario he had planned with the bizarre reality of his Prime Omega holding a seminar for his kidnappers. Axel, looking like a confused attack dog that had been commanded to sit mid-lunge, slowly, very slowly lowered the barrel of his AA-12 toward the floor. Dominic just stared at me. He looked at the snapped zip ties on the floor, the weeping thugs, and then back to the metal pipe in my hand. For a man who controlled the New York underworld with an iron fist, the enigma looked profoundly, hopelessly lost for words. Well, I tapped the pipe against the chair again, raising a perfectly manicured eyebrow at my 3 lethal, terrified, and utterly bewildered lovers. Since you broke my door and disrupted my class, grab a seat. The lesson is about to resume. The 3 most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard actually obeyed. Well, obeyed might be too strong a word. They simply gravitated toward the perimeter of the room, their posture shifting from imminent slaughter to captivated audience. Axel lowered his AA-12, completely the massive enforcer, crossing his Kevlar-clad arms over his chest. Julian holstered his MP7 beneath his slate-gray coat, slipping his hands into his pockets. Dominic simply leaned against a concrete pillar, an imperceptible dark amusement finally thawing the world-ending void in his eyes. Through the quad bond, the suffocating, apocalyptic pressure of their pheromones began to ease. The raw iron winter ozone and midnight steel warmed, blending smoothly with the soothing, heavy silk of my own scent. They weren't just standing down, they were watching me with a collective radiant pride that made my chest flutter. But I had a class to finish. I turned my attention back to Leather, who was currently trembling so violently I thought he might rattle his own teeth loose. I tapped the metal pipe against my open palm. Let's review your foundational errors. I began adopting the crisp, articulate cadence of a university professor. Error number 1, equipment. If you are going to abduct a high-value asset, do not use commercial-grade zip ties purchased from a hardware store. A child with a rudimentary understanding of leverage and joint mechanics could break them. My wrists are bruised and my aesthetic is ruined. It is embarrassing for both of us. Leather whimpered his eyes, darting frantically between me and the three towering apex predators standing in the shadows behind me. Eyes on the board, please. I snapped the pipe against the chair, forcing his terrified gaze back to me. Error number 2, extraction logistics. You parked your getaway van horizontally across the loading dock. Not only did you trap yourselves inside, but you completely blocked your primary egress route. In a live fire scenario, you created your own kill box. That is tactical suicide. Axel let out a low, rumbling chuckle from the back of the room. The sound was rough and entirely lethal, causing the chip eater on the floor to curl into an even tighter ball. And finally, I sighed, letting my pipe lower to the floor. Error number 3. Frankly, this is the one I find most personally offensive, the cinematography. Julian raised a single tailored eyebrow, a smirk finally playing at the corner of his elegant mouth. Backlighting your hostage against a grimy window. An elevated camera angle. I shook my head in profound disappointment. You completely obscured my facial features and minimized any psychological threat you hoped to project. A ransom video is essentially a marketing campaign, gentlemen. You are selling fear. You cannot sell fear with the production value of a 2010 webcam vlog. I began to slowly pace the concrete floor, my boots making soft, deliberate clicks in the echoing space. Now, I said, my tone shifting from academic to strictly professional. I looked over my shoulder toward my mates. Julian, darling. The tactician straightened up slightly, his brilliant blue eyes locking onto mine. Yes, my heart. Before you waste your extraordinary intellect tracing offshore shell accounts or hacking into the local telecom grids, I said, tossing the rusted metal pipe aside. It clattered noisily into a corner. You can cancel the search algorithms. I already have the operational intelligence. Julian paused his hand halfway to the sleek tablet he kept in his inner coat pocket. He looked at me, his sharp mind visibly recalibrating. You do. Of course I do, I replied smoothly. Our friend Leather here has a very fragile ego and an incredibly loud mouth. He was bragging about his impending promotion before you even crossed the bridge. I stepped carefully over a puddle of questionable origin on the floor, making my way toward my men. The contract was issued by the Bronx Syndicate. They outsourced the abduction to this local crew to keep their fingerprints off it. The atmosphere in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The pride in the bond was suddenly laced with a razor-sharp, calculating chill. "The Syndicate," Dominic murmured. The Enigma's voice was like crushed velvet over broken glass, soft, elegant, and entirely merciless. How ambitious of them. Indeed. I nodded, stopping a few feet away from Dominic. And since Leather was kind enough to narrate his entire payday fantasy aloud, I also know that this kidnapping was meant to be a distraction. The Syndicate is planning a synchronized strike on our inbound shipping containers at Dock 44, tomorrow night at 2 a.m. The absolute silence returned, but this time it was the silence of 3 master strategists simultaneously rewriting their war plans. Julian finally pulled out his tablet, his thumbs flying across the glass screen at blinding speed as he relayed the new coordinates to our strike teams. Axel's jaw clenched, his eyes tracking back to the thugs on the floor with renewed terrifying interest. I turned back to the amateur kidnappers one last time. They were staring at me with the dawning, horrifying realization that I hadn't been their prisoner. They had been my informants. Based on your equipment, your tactical awareness, and your complete inability to maintain operational security, I adjusted the cuffs of my black turtleneck, ensuring they were perfectly straight. I'm afraid I have to give this abduction an F. I clicked my tongue in pity, turning my back on them entirely. I walked the remaining distance to Dominic, reaching up to casually dust a non-existent speck of concrete powder off the broad shoulder of his charcoal cashmere coat. Well, I looked up into Dominic's dark, endlessly deep eyes, a genuine fond smile finally touching my lips. Class dismissed. How was my presentation? For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the ruined warehouse was the wind howling through the blasted loading dock doors. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at me, the world-ending void in his dark eyes slowly giving way to something infinitely more dangerous. Utter, absolute devotion, the suffocating weight of his enigma aura, that crushing midnight and cold steel shifted. It stopped pressing down on the room and instead wrapped entirely around me, heavy, possessive, and impossibly warm. A slow, terrifying smile finally curved Dominic's lips. It was a smile that had signaled the collapse of cartels and the rewriting of the New York skyline. "Flawless as always, my heart," Dominic murmured. He moved forward, his strides measured and silent, despite the debris on the concrete. He didn't look at the trembling thugs on the floor. He didn't need to. He walked right past them, his Italian leather dress shoe coming down deliberately on the cracked smartphone they had used to record the ransom video. A loud crunching sound of glass and plastic completely shattering under his heel was loud and final. Leather, the so-called boss of this pathetic crew, flinched as if Dominic had stepped on his actual throat. However, the enigma continued, stopping just inches from me. He reached out his gloved fingers, gently tracing the line of my jaw, checking for bruises the cheap zip ties couldn't have possibly inflicted. "Your students seem to lack the fundamental intelligence required to appreciate your lecture." "Can I shoot them now?" Axel interrupted. The towering alpha hadn't relaxed. If anything, the realization that I was perfectly fine had simply cleared his mind, allowing him to focus entirely on a retribution. He racked the slide of his AA-12 automatic shotgun. The heavy metallic sound echoed like a death sentence. The scent of raw smoke and molten iron flared aggressively through the bond, burning the back of my throat. "I've been very patient, Keegan. I just want to turn the one in the fake leather jacket into Swiss cheese. Just a little bit. As a treat." I turned my head, resting my cheek briefly against Dominic's palm before stepping toward Axel. "No, Axel," I said softly, coming to a halt in front of the massive enforcer. He glared down at me, his chest heaving against his tactical rig, his eyes flashing with raw, untamed alpha dominance. To anyone else, he was a nightmare given flesh. To me, he was just my overly protective, heavily armed attack dog. I reached up, placing my bare hand flat against the center of his Kevlar-plated chest. I pushed a wave of my own pheromones, night-blooming flowers, and heavy silk directly into his system. Axel let out a low, involuntary rumble from deep within his chest, his tense shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch under my touch. "Shooting them is too quick," I explained smoothly, tracing the edge of his tactical vest. "It's wasteful, and frankly, it requires us to hire a cleanup crew to scrub this warehouse, which is a logistical nightmare this late at night." I turned back to look at the pathetic pile of humanity groveling on the floor. Leather was silently weeping, his hands clasped together in a desperate prayer. The chip eater had passed out entirely. "I have a better idea," I announced, my voice echoing clearly. "Since they are so desperate to work for the syndicate, and since their tactical skills are non-existent, I believe they require an internship." Julian, who had been quietly monitoring the local police scanners on his tablet, paused. He looked up, a sharp, genuine amusement lighting up his brilliant blue eyes. The winter ozone of his scent suddenly smelled crisp and energized. "An internship." "Precisely." I nodded. I looked at Dominic, intentionally deferring to him. I didn't have to. I was the Prime Omega, a legend in my own right. But the quad bond thrived on balance. Letting Dominic issue the final ruling satisfied the Enigma's primal need to protect and govern his pack. "What do you think, Dom? I believe the Biohazard Disposal Division is currently short-staffed." Dominic's dark eyes locked onto mine, understanding exactly what I was doing. The respect and adoration in his gaze deepened. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling onto the trembling thugs like a physical weight. "Congratulations, gentlemen." Dominic's voice was like velvet dipped in liquid nitrogen. "You have just been drafted. For the next 5 years, you will serve as the primary trauma cleanup crew for the Sterling organization. You will scrub blood off concrete. You will dissolve teeth in acid. You will work 80-hour weeks without a single cent of financial compensation. If you attempt to run, if you complain, or if you ever cross the bridge into Manhattan again." Dominic didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the freezing air, far more terrifying than the barrel of Axel's shotgun. Julian," Dominic said without looking away from the weeping men. "Process their biometrics. I want their names, their families, and their miserable little lives permanently logged into our tracking servers." "Already done," Julian replied cheerfully, tapping the screen of his tablet. "Welcome to the corporate ladder, boys." I smiled, completely satisfied. I took a step back, allowing my 3 partners to surround me. This was the true power of our bond. I was the blade, the distraction, the mastermind. But they were the storm that followed. "Let's go home," Axel grumbled, finally slinging the massive shotgun over his broad shoulder. He stepped close to me, his massive hand settling heavily on the small of my back, fiercely territorial. "Yes," Dominic agreed, offering me his arm with the grace of a 19th century duke. "The air in Brooklyn is ruining your scent, darling." I slipped my arm through Dominic's, allowing Julian to fall in step on my other side, while Axel covered our rear. We walked out of the warehouse in perfect, terrifying formation, stepping out into the freezing pre-dawn air toward the waiting line of idling armored G-wagons. Behind us, the amateur kidnappers clutched each other on the dirty concrete, sobbing in sheer, unadulterated psychological horror as the reality of their new lives set in. They hadn't just messed with the underworld, they had messed with its prime omega. I settled into the plush leather seat of the primary SUV, sighing as the heavy bulletproof door thudded shut, sealing us inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. But as the convoy peeled away from the loading dock, heading back toward the Manhattan skyline, the adrenaline of the performance finally began to fade. The silence inside the SUV wasn't the relaxed quiet of a completed mission. It was heavy, thick. I glanced at Julian sitting across from me. He had taken his glasses off his knuckles, white as he gripped the edge of his tablet. Beside me, Axel's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently near his ear, and Dominic was staring straight ahead, the enigma aura in the confined space suddenly turning cold and sharp. The performance was over. My kidnappers had been dealt with. But looking at the dark, simmering fury in my mate's eyes, I realized with a sudden jolt of genuine apprehension, my punishment was just about to begin. The private elevator ride up to the penthouse was the longest 90 seconds of my life. There was no ambient music, no casual debriefing, no lingering adrenaline, just the soft, expensive hum of the mechanics pulling us 70 floors above the waking city of Manhattan. The silence inside the steel box was absolute, but the quad bond in my chest was screaming. It was a chaotic, crushing vortex of dark emotions, fear masquerading as fury relief, choking on panic, and a desperate, agonizing possessiveness that made my skin prickle. The brass doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling, multi-million-dollar expanse of our living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the early morning sky, painting the Italian marble floors in pale, icy blues and grays. Axel stepped out first. The massive Alpha didn't say a word as he unclipped his tactical rig, letting the heavy Kevlar and the AA-12 shotgun drop onto the pristine white sofa with a dull, heavy thud. He stalked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, his broad back completely rigid. The scent of raw smoke and molten iron rolling off him wasn't aggressive anymore. It smelled like scorched earth, like a battlefield after the war is lost. Dominic walked to the crystal decanters on the mahogany bar. He moved with his usual terrifying grace, the charcoal cashmere coat settling around his frame. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy tumbler, but he didn't drink it. He just gripped the glass, his knuckles turning stark white, the enigma void wrapping around him so tightly he seemed to absorb the light in the room. And Julian stood frozen in the center of the living room, his slate gray suit perfectly pressed, his posture straight. I took a breath, trying to summon the cocky, untouchable prime omega persona that had served me so well in the warehouse. I rolled my shoulders, casually rubbing my bruised wrists. "Well," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast space, aiming for a light, dismissive tone. "I suppose I should apologize for ruining the morning itinerary. If someone wants to draw a bath, I think I still smell like cheap Brooklyn concrete." And a sharp and violent clattering sound echoed. I stopped. Julian had reached up, ripped his bespoke, wire-framed glasses from his face, and thrown them blindly across the marble kitchen island. They hit the stone and skittered off the edge, dropping to the floor. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. For the first time since I had known him, Julian Reed's brilliant, calculating blue eyes were completely unhinged. The icy, structured winter ozone of his scent suddenly turned into a blinding, suffocating blizzard. He crossed the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. He didn't strike me. He didn't use alpha dominance to force me down. Instead, his hands, the same hands that typed at the speed of light to rewrite global financial systems, grabbed my shoulders, and they were shaking, violently shaking. "Do you think this is funny?" Julian's voice cracked. It wasn't a roar, it was a fractured, agonizing whisper that broke something deep inside my chest. "Do you think this is a game, Keegan?" "Julian." I started, genuinely startled by the raw panic in the tactician. "No." Julian gave me a desperate, jarring shake. His fingers dug into my tailored turtleneck. I run the numbers, Keegan. I calculate the probabilities. I can account for rival syndicates. I can account for heavily armed strike teams. I can hack into every goddamn camera on the eastern seaboard to keep you safe. A tear, hot and entirely uncharacteristic, spilled over his lower lash line. He didn't even notice. But I cannot. Julian's voice shattered completely. I cannot put into an algorithm the variable that the center of my universe will willingly walk into a kill box just because he is bored. I can't calculate you throwing your life away. I froze. The words hit me harder than a physical blow. A sudden cracking sound echoed. Behind me, the heavy crystal tumbler in Dominic's hand finally gave way under the pressure of his grip, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. The enigma didn't even flinch as bourbon and blood dripped from his palm onto the mahogany bar. He is right. Dominic's voice was barely a vibration in the air, cold, hollow, and utterly devastated. You were playing a game, but we were mourning. For 10 minutes, my heart stopped beating. I looked from Dominic's bleeding hand to Julian's weeping, frantic eyes, and finally to Axel. The giant enforcer had turned around, tears silently tracking through the soot on his cheeks, his expression one of pure, unadulterated agony. Suddenly, the joke was dead. The untouchable assassin, the Prime Omega who operated solo and laughed in the face of death, suddenly realized his own fatal flaw. I wasn't solo anymore. My life didn't just belong to me. My heart beat in 3 other chests, and I had carelessly, selfishly dragged all 3 of them through hell just for my own amusement. The guilt was a physical weight, dropping me right out of my pride. My voice faltered, the cultured cadence stripping away to reveal the raw, vulnerable man underneath. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my tactical superiority. Instead, I intentionally tore down the impenetrable biological walls I always kept up. I let my scent, heavy night-blooming flowers and blood-soaked silk spill into the room utterly unguarded, carrying nothing but submission, regret, and profound love. I stepped fully into Julian's space, reaching up to cover his shaking hands with my own. Then, maintaining eye contact with the broken tactician, I slowly lowered myself down. My knee hit the plush, imported rug with a soft thud. I kneeled there on the floor of our empire, completely surrendering my posture. I tilted my head back, exposing the pale skin of my throat and the faded claiming marks that bound us together. I offered them my vulnerability. I offered them the ultimate control they desperately needed to feel secure again. I was wrong, I whispered up to my 3 kings, my eyes burning with my own unshed tears. Discipline me, punish me, do whatever you need to do, just please stop looking at me like you lost me. The Italian marble floor was freezing against my bare knee, but the heat radiating from the 3 apex predators surrounding me was a suffocating, intoxicating inferno. For a second, the heavy silence of the penthouse stretched taut as a wire. I remained perfectly still, my head tilted back, my neck completely exposed, waiting. Then the wire snapped. Axel moved first. The towering enforcer didn't speak. He simply dropped to his knees in front of me, his massive, calloused hands gripping my hips with bruising desperation. He buried his face into the curve of my neck, inhaling my scent, my entirely unguarded submission, like a drowning man finally breaking the surface for air. A raw, ragged sound tore from his throat, a mix of a feral growl and a broken sob vibrating directly against my collarbone. Then Julian was there, sinking down beside Axel, his hands no longer shaking with tactical panic, but with a frantic, desperate need framed my face. He kissed me hard, messy, and entirely devoid of his usual calculated, brilliant grace. It tasted of salt bourbon and the lingering winter ozone of his pheromones. Never again. Julian breathed against my swollen lips, his blue eyes fierce, wild, and wet. Never do that to us again, Keegan. You don't have the right to play with our sanity. I promise. I whispered the words of vow stamped into my very soul. Dominic didn't kneel. He didn't have to. The enigma stepped forward, his presence wrapping around the 3 of us in a crushing, absolute canopy of midnight and cold steel. He reached down, weaving his long, elegant fingers through my hair, gently forcing my head to tilt back even further. He stared down at the faded, silver-scarred claiming marks that littered the pale skin of my throat. You asked for discipline, my heart. Dominic's voice was a velvet threat, dark and heavy with unadulterated possession. You offered us control. We accept. Before I could brace myself, Axel hooked his massive arms under my knees and shoulders, lifting me effortlessly from the marble floor. He carried me through the sprawling living room past the shattered crystal on the mahogany bar and into the master suite, while Dominic and Julian flanked us like a royal lethal guard. They didn't throw me onto the massive king-size bed. They laid me down with an agonizing, deliberate reverence. The bedroom was bathed in the pale, icy blue light of the Manhattan skyline, but the shadows in this room belonged entirely to them. My punishment wasn't pain. It was an overwhelming sensory consumption. They needed to overwrite the stench of the Brooklyn warehouse, the ghost of the cheap zip ties, and the terrifying reality of those 10 minutes they thought they had lost me. They needed to violently, completely anchor me back to them. Axel took my wrists, his large thumbs pressing over the faint red marks left by the plastic ties. He lowered his heavy head and bit down over my pulse point, not enough to break the skin, but hard enough to make me gasp. He dragged his teeth over the sensitive flesh, a low territorial rumble vibrating in his chest, claiming the pathetic bruises as his own territory. Julian took my left side, his lips tracing the sharp line of my jaw before descending to the faded claiming mark resting just above my collarbone. He sank his teeth into the old scar, reopening the biological tether. The sharp, sudden pain was immediately followed by a torrential rush of his pheromones, crisp snow, and ozone flooding my nervous system, washing away the last stubborn remnants of my assassin's adrenaline. I arched off the mattress, a soft, helpless moan escaping my throat as my fingers tangled in his slate-gray hair. And Dominic took the center. He straddled my hips, pinning me beneath the magnificent, suffocating weight of his enigma aura. He didn't rush. He watched my face as Axel and Julian marked me, his dark, endlessly deep eyes blazing with an ancient, primal satisfaction. When I was completely pliant, gasping and drowning in their combined sense, Dominic finally lowered his head to the primary bond mark, right over my beating heart. "You are the razor to the world," Dominic murmured against my skin, his fangs grazing the sensitive flesh, sending violent shivers down my spine. "But in this room, in this bed, you are ours. Only ours." He bit down. The world shattered into a kaleidoscope of heat, pleasure, and absolute surrender. The quad bond flared into a blinding supernova in my chest. I didn't fight it. I didn't try to maintain my arrogant, untouchable facade. I let go completely, my nails lightly scoring their broad shoulders as they devoured me, worshipped me, and anchored me to the earth. For hours, the penthouse bedroom was a symphony of entangled limbs, breathless vows, and the heavy, intoxicating blend of smoke, winter air, midnight, and my own blood-soaked silk. They mapped every inch of my body, replacing the phantom fear of loss with overwhelming possessive pleasure until I was too exhausted to move, entirely cocooned in their protective embrace. Eventually, the storm subsided into a heavy, peaceful exhaustion. I lay in the center of the massive bed, my head resting on Dominic's chest, lulled by the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat. Axel's heavy arm was slung securely across my waist, pinning me to the mattress, as if afraid I might float away, while Julian was curled against my back, his face buried deeply in my hair. I closed my eyes, a soft, contented smile touching my lips. Being the prime Omega, the untouchable independent contractor, was a thrilling, dangerous game. But this absolute surrender, knowing I had 3 kings willing to burn the world to ashes just to keep me safe, this was the ultimate privilege. Outside the soundproof glass, the city of New York was beginning to wake. And somewhere in the decaying heart of Brooklyn, a group of weeping, terrified thugs were currently scrubbing blood off concrete, praying for mercy. By tomorrow, the underworld would whisper a new terrifying rumor. If you cross the syndicate, you die. But if you touch the razor, you do not get the mercy of a quick death. You get a 5-year internship in hell. I let the thought drift away, safe claimed, and completely loved as I finally surrendered to sleep.